All right. We are very lucky today to have Dr. Sarah Cornfield with us. She is an associate professor of communication and women's and gender studies at Hope College, where she teaches classes in rhetoric, the study of public persuasion, and feminist theory. Dr. Cornfield's research focuses on the portrayal of gender in media, primarily studying television. Her work is published across academic journals, and she's the author of Contemporary Rhetorical Criticism, a book designed to teach students how to analyze public culture. I think we all need to know how to analyze public culture. Dr. Cornfield spends all of her time thinking and talking, especially when she is also cooking or running. Dr. Cornfield lives in Holland, Michigan with her spouse and their young children. Welcome, Sarah, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you. All right, so on my screen, I can see my slides, and I think I might see you if you talk, but otherwise I don't see you, so I don't see your reaction. So if you want to interject or you have a question, right, make a little bit of noise, don't be shy. And we'll definitely have time for discussion at the end, and you have that chat feature as well if you want to pop a question in to kind of save it for later. All right, so the work that I'm presenting today is called Televising Me Too. I'm thinking about it explicitly in terms of the Me Too movement. This article, this research has already been published in a journal called Feminist Media Studies, which is a pretty big deal in my world. And it's co-authored with my former student named Hannah Jones. Oh no. There, I figured out how to bring her photo on. It's co-authored with my former student named Hannah Jones. So one of the things that I came to Hope because I wanted to be able to do this, one of the things that it's something that's just a great joy to me and something really I find fulfilling is teaching students how to do the work that I do, teaching students how to analyze public culture. And sometimes I get to work one-on-one with students in this way. And so I was able to do that with Hannah Jones on this particular project. And so just really delighted that that collaboration has come so far. All right, so we are beginning here by thinking about the context of the Me Too movement. So this photo up at the top here, I've got a little laser pointer on it. This is Tarana Burke, and she has been doing ongoing activism to end sexual violence for decades. And it's her phrase, Me Too, that then is tweeted out by actor Alyssa Milano in 2017. And that's the tweet that Milano sent. If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too as a reply to this tweet. So that phrase Me Too was contextualized in Tarana Burke's work as a kind of whispered refrain, as the sort of thing that went around the room after somebody had originally disclosed, right? As a way of saying you're not alone and you're not going to be alone as we work through this. And Milano uses it in a kind of like, grab a megaphone and let's raise some awareness, right? So there's a difference in the way these two activists had been using the phrase. Tarana Burke, it was solidarity and inside, and Alyssa Milano uses it to kind of try to show society how big the problem is, right? So that's the kind of context that we're thinking about here as we think about the Me Too movement and these sort of stories that have become part of our mainstream conversations. So there's a background here that we need to think about more deeply because our research, Hannah Jones and my research, is looking at the way in which television series portrayed Me Too movements and had episodes that spun out Me Too storylines. But we need to think about this in a broader context, reaching back into the 1970s, where we had activists like Gloria Steinem and Audre Lorde, where we had the ERA, right? So where we had wide-stream feminist activism. And that activism, if you're familiar with names like Brown Miller, this activism very much emphasized the fact that sexual violence and harassment is happening, that it's a barrier to women's entry into workplaces, that it is right, a chronic, ongoing violence in our society. So Me Too is by far not the first time that we've had widespread conversations about this type of violence. And television is this wonderful, amazing storyteller. And what television does 9 times out of 10 is it holds up a funhouse mirror to society, right? If something is a hot topic in real world, then you can expect to see it show up in one way or another on television episodes. And so in the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s, this activism, feminist activism, began to show up in television on series like the Rockford Files, for those of you who might be familiar with that. So it began to show up in crime dramas and police procedurals, which is really an interesting place to think about featuring sexual violence. And it still shows up there in things like Law and Order Special Victims Unit, SVU. So, but during the 1970s, we had this wide scale portrayal of sexual violence seeping into these men's mystery police sort of procedurals. And a lot of feminist scholars have studied that work and those television shows. And what they really found is that as television incorporated portrayals of sexual violence, it was really televising rape myths. So these are myths that are like, there's a whole bunch of myths, but rape myths are the idea that, it really was the victim's fault. What was she wearing? Why was she walking alone? A woman could stop a rape if she didn't want it, right? So all of these sort of kind of myths that set the bar really high for actually proving that you were experiencing sexual violence. And so studying these older shows from the 70s, but also in the ways in which these storylines then got incorporated into like special episodes on teen dramas like Dawson's Creek or 90210, like those teen dramas. What television scholars have really found is that when sexual violence shows up on TV, it seems to be something that happens to and is about women. So it's a women's problem, right? The perpetrators of sexual violence are typically non-recurring characters who jump out of alleyways or lurk in unsafe environments, right? And these television episodes focus on the differences between shadowy bad men and normal men. So these create these kind of story arcs that valorize male protagonists like Rockford, right? That valorize these male protagonists as saviors who rescue women and restore justice. And so masculinity shows up as the solution, which is kind of paradoxical because in a lot of cases of sexual violence, a lot of cases of sexual violence are perpetrated by men, and there seems to be something about how we talk about masculinity that sets up a system of violence. So this is the kind of the context or the background as Hannah and I came to study what was going on in television when we fast forward to 2017, right? So we'll get to the shows that we analyzed in just a moment. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about what some of the best practices are. So when therapists and social workers and politicians and feminist scholars talk about how we can act and law enforcement talk about how we can actually end sexual violence, we tend to look at these 3 elements as kind of best practices. So the idea here, as Tarana Burke states, is that sexual violence is about power and privilege. It's not about individuals. So you can see there in the pink box, we're talking about this idea of trying to change culture, right? The problem is culture, not so-called bad apples. And this can feel a little bit strange, right? It can take us aback, right? Like we think, well, no, there's an actual person who's going around hurting others. Like if we could stop that person, we would solve the problem, right? But what law enforcement and feminist scholars and social workers have been seeing time and time again is that you can lock up Weinstein, but somebody's going to take his place. Right. So if you have an individual approach, then we're just locking up one bad apple after another bad apple, but the bucket has a lot of bad apples in it. Right. And so at some point you have to stand back and ask, well, what's going on with these apples? Right. Like, what are the conditions that are making these apples turn bad? And if we can stop those conditions, right, then we'll be in a better place. There's another analogy here. It's a little bit more dramatic, but I think it helps us kind of see the point here. The analogy goes like this. If you were standing by a river and you saw a baby floating down the river, right? Like you would reach out and save the baby, right? Like, well done, you. You saved the baby. But as you have just saved the baby and are drying it off, you see another baby floating down the river and you reach out and save that baby too, right? And you can stand there all day reaching out and saving babies, but at some point you got to go upriver and find out how the babies are getting into the river, right? Like you got to go upstream. And that's the premise here. When we talk about trying to change culture itself, we're saying, okay, what if we go upstream? How did these apples turn? What are the conditions that have caused apples to turn out bad, right? What's happening up the river that so many babies are in the water? Okay, so here are the 3 best practices. They talk about the idea that if we actually want to change culture, we need to think about revealing how hierarchy works, revealing how structures work, as opposed to focusing on just the individual, right? If all you do is point out that Weinstein was a bad person, okay, you made a true statement, but you didn't go upriver, right? So we're thinking about how do we talk about the conditions, how powerful Weinstein was, how financially lucrative he was, or Epstein, right? Or Matt Lauer, or right? Like we can name these people, Bill O'Reilly, we can name these people endlessly because there's a condition that has to do with money and power and hierarchy that is leading people to turn a blind eye to their actions, right? So one of the best practices is to focus on that idea of the structure, the conditions, the bucket, as opposed to focusing on the individual. This second, and apparently PowerPoint made all of these number 1, thank you PowerPoint, but our second best practice here is to think about using disclosures. How do we say me too? How do we tell a story about sexual violence that spurs others' activism? Right? So sometimes we tell stories in a way that weaponize that story. Or sometimes we tell stories in a way that focus on healing and catharsis, like, I've said it and now I'm healed. It's not usually how it works. But we want to think about, how do we tell stories? How do we disclose sexual violence in a way that then spurs activism, so that the disclosure is a beginning as opposed to an ending? And the third best practice here is this idea that we would be getting bystanders involved, right? So bystanders are people who can disrupt rape culture. And rape culture is just the fancy term for how we talk about a society that raises bad apples, right? A society that raises, and we can think about this as society writ large, but we can also think about it as microcosms, like television newsrooms and media industries and that sort of stuff, right? So we want to think about how do we get bystanders who are going to say something when they see something, as opposed to bystanders who just shrug it off, say, not my problem, or I don't really know what's going on, or, oh, I'm too nervous to do anything, right? How do we get into that sort of work? There's 2 other pieces that we want to point out. Consent training is really important, and I don't want to dismiss it. But consent training has been shown to be inadequate as a solution. So consent training is when you train people to seek consent before engaging in sexual activity. So instead of just, walking up and kissing the person you have a crush on, you might walk up and say, I really like you and I really want to kiss you. Really? And that would give the person a chance to say, yes, let's do that. Or, oh, sorry, you misunderstand the situation, right? So consent training is when we teach people to use their words and their body language to actively seek consent. But that has been shown to be inadequate. So here's why. Perpetrators can coerce victims into seemingly granting permission and thus creating the illusion of consent to mask their abuse of power, right? So perpetrators can coerce, they can say, can I kiss you? But if they have so much power, or if they say, before they say, can I kiss you, if they say things like, wow, your career could really take off, I could help you out a lot, can I kiss you? Really, you know what, that's no longer a equitable sort of situation. And so in addition to this kind of masking an abuse of power, as cases like Monica Lewinsky's, so Monica Lewinsky recounts of her relationship with then President Bill Clinton, right? She had enthusiastic consent, and yet an abuse of power were coexisting in the same relationship. And so when we want to talk about ending sexual violence, as we want to talk about ending inequality and right, these abuses of power, we need something more than consent to go on. One of the other things that we need is this idea that we wouldn't be talking about it in a both sides sort of world. So I understand that in legal frameworks, when you're in a law court system, right, then defendants and what's the word for the other person, the person who brings the charge? Oh dear. Well, anyways, there's two sides and they both get full hearing, and they ought to get full hearing. But that's not necessarily true, especially in our fiction, okay? We don't always need to say, well, let's hear the other side, right? Like we can have stories that are one-sided in fiction, because fiction is not a law court. And this is an important thing for us to think through. Okay, so anyways, these three best practices became our analytical framework. So we had in mind, as we watched all of these television shows, we had in mind this concept of, okay, does it reveal structures? Are these disclosures, these Me Too storylines spurring activism? And are we watching bystanders who are disrupting rape culture? Okay, so what we did was we surveyed 30 fictional television episodes that featured Me Too stories. They had to air after Alyssa Milano's 2017 tweet and when we were doing our research, which was summer of 2020. And so these are just a couple of the shows that we did on screen. So Grey's Anatomy had a Me Too episode. There's on Netflix's show Sex Education, there was a Me Too storyline in the second season. There were a number of Law and Order Special Victims Unit storylines that did, I think there was an Epstein episode and a Matt Lauer episode that we used from there. There was a Me Too storyline on Jane the Virgin. The Disney Corporation runs a channel called Freeform for teenagers. There was a Me Too storyline on their show, The Bold Type. The reboot of Murphy Brown had a Me Too storyline. The episode was titled #Murphy2. Younger on TV Land had a Me Too storyline. Again, very creatively, they titled their episode #Liza2. The Good Fight had a number, right? That is a law court procedural. It had a number, and we did a bunch of other television series as well. So like Veep had an episode. Madam Secretary had an episode. Brooklyn Nine-Nine had an episode. So did the reboot for Charmed, right? So we basically just cast as wide a net as we could. And the way we identified if we were going to analyze the episode is if they were specifically using the Me Too vocabulary. So like their titles, #Murphy2, or if they said the words Me Too in the episode, or if they clearly had taken the episode from real world Me Too storylines, like the Epstein episodes on Law and Order. So we were looking very specifically for these episodes that very clearly were invoking Me Too storylines. Okay, so that's kind of our landscape. And now I'm going to show you how I'm just going to focus on the good stuff, the things that we said, hey, you know what, that was a pretty good model. Well done, you. There were about a third of the episodes that we thought, yeah, really nailed it there. There were about a third of the episodes that we thought, oh no, like that's the old rape myths. We have seen that since the 1970s, like, oh no. And there's about a third of the episodes in the middle that often did both sides. So they had some things that were really good, and then they had some things that were like, well, but maybe he didn't mean it. We'll never know. And it was like, well, actually, that's not a helpful storyline to put out into the public fiction. Okay. So I'm going to show you the happy things. And if you want to know more about the less optimistic elements, we can talk about that during Q&A. Okay. So in our first approach here, how do these series display structures, right? How do they, instead of focusing on the individual, how do we bring the structure, the current in the river, to go back to that analogy, or what is the nature of the bucket that all of our apples are in, right? Like, what are the conditions here going on? I'm going to show you a couple examples. This first one is from the Bold Type. So what's happened in the Bold Type in their Me Too storyline is that Jane, this is Jane here, she's a journalist. She writes for a magazine that is essentially like Teen Vogue or Cosmopolitan. And she is doing, she's doing research and finds out that her magazine, this is her editor-in-chief, Jacqueline, she finds out that her magazine uses 14-year-old models, pictures of 14-year-old models, in very highly sexualized poses. And when she finds that out, she's really taken aback. And she comes to Jacqueline and she says, like that's kind of an abuse of power, right? We're telling these girls who are children that if they want to get a payday, if they want to work for us, then they have to do really sexy stuff. And Jacqueline takes a moment and Jacqueline begins by saying, like, well, we've done nothing wrong, right? Like, we didn't hire those girls. We just picked the photos afterwards. Like, I'm not the photographer or the director of that photo shoot who asked them to do that, right? So Jacqueline's first moment is like, hey, no, like that happened over there and we're way over here, right? But the more she thinks about it, right, the more she comes to realize, oh, no, it's a system, right? There's an economic function at play here, and I am culpable in it, right? So it's this idea of, right, although she's not the one taking the photo, she is turning a blind eye, right, to this kind of hierarchical networked element, where you have the fashion magazine, you have the photography practice, you have the modeling agency, and she can see the structure, and she can recognize that her magazine is complicit in this larger organization that ends up sexualizing young girls. And so she has this kind of poignant moment where she's realizing this, and then she calls her whole staff together and she literally says, abuse does not happen in a vacuum, right? She says, like, there's a reason that this is happening and we're part of it, right? And so she commits to holding her magazine, Scarlet Magazine, accountable to higher standards, and to no longer using underage models. This creates a lot of drama in the episode because they have to throw out a bunch of the pictures from their upcoming issue, which is supposed to go to print in less than 24 hours, typical TV. But you know, it's a really beautiful moment as she's able to see for herself and therefore explain to viewers, abuse does not happen in a vacuum, right? there's a networking here of the modeling agencies, the photography practices, and then my magazine. So even though I feel like my hands are clean, I'm part of this, right? It's bigger than just a bad apple. There's a really similar sort of revealing of structures that goes on in TV Land's Younger. So on Younger, this is Liza. She's our protagonist. And she, in their Me Too episode, hashtag Liza2, Liza had previously worked with a fantasy author. So it's a publishing, she works for a publishing industry. They publish mostly fiction, and she had worked with a fantasy author who was kind of scummy, greasy, gross, you know, sexually harassy in earlier episodes that the show had kind of laughed off. The show hadn't really made a big deal out of it. And so now when they come back with this episode, hashtag Liza2, they pull this meeting together that you can see there on screen. This is the big boss. He owns the publishing industry. This is her marketing, and this is the actual editor who is working with that fantasy author. So they pull them all together because Liza's quote unquote a lowly assistant. But this matters, right? Like when you think about who in an industry like this, who is going to be sexually harassed, they are usually people low on the hierarchy because they don't have the power to protect themselves. So here's Liza, our lowly assistant. And they call this meeting back together and they say, hey, Liza, we're going to work with that author again, but we're a little bit worried. Like we've heard some rumors that maybe he sexually harasses people. So they straight up ask her, did he sexually harass you? Right? But before she can answer, and the answer would have and should have been yes, before she can answer, this woman, Diana Trout in red, Diana Trout says, remember, Liza, how an allegation against this author could financially destroy the company. Right. So the author makes them a lot of money. And without his latest book release, right, like they are actually, as a book industry, afraid that they're going to go under. Right. So before she can give the answer, right, she's then coached. Hey, don't actually make an allegation, right? Like it could have big financial repercussions. And so Liza says, he's just flirty, right? Everything's fine. He's just flirty. But then later on in the episode, he sexually harasses Liza in a very overt way. And she goes and she talks to a bunch of the other women who are part of their industry, who are also assistants, so at her rank. And she finds out that he has been sexually harassing them as well. So she pulls this meeting back together, and her big boss pulls the book and doesn't publish it, right? So all sorts of lovely responses there. But it's a really telling moment because when they get together and they say, okay, we have to cancel this book, one of them says, oh my, you know, like, how did we not know? And it's at this moment that Diana, the one who said basically, don't speak up, Diana says, and I want to get the quote right. She says, oh, let's be honest. We all knew. We just didn't want to believe our golden goose was a horny toad. Right. So the scene really emphasizes these financial structures at play in workplace sexual violence. It demonstrates how economic motivations can enable and protect abusers, how they silence survivors, and how they cause bystanders to willfully turn a blind eye to sexual violence. So we thought that those were some really lovely, clear examples of some of the ways in which television shows that are incorporating Me Too episodes can display structures. And this is one of the harder things to do, right? It's like, well, how do you see what's beyond the moment, right? And I thought that these two narratives really captured that quite beautifully. I'm going to move on. I hope you guys are doing okay. I can't see you, but I believe that we're all hanging in here together. So I'm going to move on to the second best practice. And this is the idea that we would have disclosures that spur activism rather than showing a disclosure as a kind of endpoint, right? So we want them to be beginnings, not endings. And Grey's Anatomy did a Me Too episode that was a really, really great example of this. So on this episode, a doctor named Joe Kovach is treating a rape patient, a patient who has come into the hospital with really significant bodily injuries. And the patient doesn't want to admit that she was raped, and the patient doesn't want to talk about her assault. And Joe Kovach does a number of things in this episode. Most poignantly, and what's on screen here, is that when the patient is being wheeled back to surgery, Joe Kovach lines the hallway with women, and these women don't know why they've been asked to come into the hallway, and the women are hiding, blocking the windows so that the patient, as she is wheeled into surgery, won't see any men, and no man will see her in this moment of distress. It's a beautiful moment of solidarity. And originally, the women lining the hallways don't understand why they're there. They've just been asked to come and stand and line the windows. But you see the light dawning on their faces, that there's a strong moment of solidarity here. So this idea of disclosure spurring others, right? So this disclosure of this woman's trauma is spurring their recognition of the magnitude of the problem, but also showing a kind of greater solidarity, right? So this is that whispered refrain, "Me too, we're in it together." But one of the really interesting parts of this particular storyline, and I'm going to put this up on screen here. So this is Dr. Joe Kovach here in the middle. She's the doctor who's been treating this patient. She's speaking to her spouse, who I know as the original Kovach from the early seasons of Grey's Anatomy. She's speaking to her spouse, and this is at the very end of the episode. And it's interesting because Joe Kovach, in order to get her patient to do the surgery, to receive treatment, and ultimately to speak to the police, Joe Kovach had to disclose her own experience with domestic violence, so sexual and physical violence at the hands of her prior husband, her ex-husband. And so there you have a really clear element of Joe Kovach is disclosing in order to spur activism, in order to, right? It's not healing for Joe, it's prompting for her patient, right? It's an act of healing that moves outward. And at the end of the episode, right, her husband, Kovach, asks her if she wants to like go hang out, meet up at a restaurant with a couple friends, right? Like it's like a Friday night sort of thing, like, hey, let's go out. And she says like, no, I don't want to. No, I don't want to. Like she can't even give him a straight answer. It's just been a long day. And he's like, yeah, it's been a long day. Like, let's kick back. She's like, no, I don't want to. And you can see here a little bit, I tried to get the right moment, but even as she moves towards the camera, as she walks away from her husband, unable to tell him why her day has been so hard, right, like he's just left confused and she's blurry and out of focus. And then as she walks down the hallway, the camera leaves her out of focus in a way that really emphasizes the idea that she's still processing her trauma, right? The fact that she was able to help someone else doesn't end the fact that she's experiencing ongoing trauma. And this is a really poignant moment in the it's how the episode ends, but it's a really poignant scene, right? It disrupts those nice and tidy truisms, right? Everything happens for a reason. Well, so long as somebody else can, you know, like I can save someone else. Like it interrupts those sort of truisms to show that this sort of violence has lasting trauma, and that we can't expect disclosure to be the end point, right? Because the trauma visits us. It's in and on our bodies. But what we can do is use disclosure for activism to help others find help. One of the other examples that was a real shout out moment was from Brooklyn NineNine. So this is Amy Santiago and her spouse, Jake Peralta. They work together in the NineNine precinct in Brooklyn. And they're on a case together. And the case seems to be a he said, she said sort of case. And the victim came to them and said, you know, I want to open a case. Like, I want you to investigate this. I want you to process this, right? So the survivor has come forward, and they are trying to follow the investigation, and they have essentially hit a roadblock where none of the other work. So the assault took place within the workplace, and none of the colleagues or coworkers will tell them the truth in interviews. And that's really obvious. So they have hit this roadblock, and Jake says, you know what, I think we should just let it go. Like, you win some, you lose some. What are we going to do? We're at a dead end. And you can see that she's disheveled. She's been working at this for over 48 hours straight. So he's come to her and is like, honey, like, you got to let this one go. Like, you win some, you lose some. Like, come on. It's going to be okay. And she says, no, like, this is not just a case for me. Like, I am not content to let this be, well, I couldn't close the case, right? And it's at this point in the episode that she discloses a case of sexual harassment from her prior captain. So the captain before she came to Brooklyn Nine-Nine, who sexually harassed her, and she says, like, this isn't just any old case for me. Like, there's an echo of the trauma that happened to me going on in what I see in this case. So they've, and keep in mind that they've been married for a couple of years now and have been a couple for several years. And I think that that's one of the reasons I particularly liked this disclosure. And the one before it from Grey's Anatomy is that it really shows how, part of what it shows is how difficult these disclosures can be, even with the people we trust the most, that so many people don't disclose this, even with their intimate partners. And that it's really difficult for Amy to disclose this to her husband. But when she does disclose it, her disclosure then motivates Jake's recommitment to the case, right? So he says, okay, we are not giving up, right? I'm going to go back. I'll do all the interviews again, right? So he gets, right, again, the disclosure isn't an end point. It's not, catharsis, it brought them together. It's activism. It's Jake's recommitment to the case, to doing those interviews again. Okay, so that's some of the better examples of what it looks like when people disclose. And then our third best practice is what it can look like when bystanders disrupt rape culture. I'm going to give two examples here. The first one is from Netflix's Sex Education. So the storyline is that Amy, this is Amy here, the blonde, she's carrying a birthday cake. The birthday cake is for her friend Maeve, who's here in the dark colored jacket. So Amy got on the bus to school that morning, and she was sexually assaulted on the bus ride in transit, as many people are. And when she gets to school, Maeve asks her what's wrong with the cake, because as she attempts to distance herself from the man who is assaulting her, she smashes part of the cake, and so the cake has had something bad happen to the cake. That's real obvious, right? So Maeve is like, hey, like, thanks for the cake, but also what happened to it? And Amy tells her the story in this kind of like, oh, no big deal. Like, this guy, like, came on my jeans on the bus. Can you believe it? And I smashed your cake. Sorry. Right. And Maeve is like, hey, like, back up, like, tell me that story again. Like, somebody ejaculated onto your pants on the bus? Like what? And Maeve was really just, Amy, the blonde, was really dismissive of it. This kind of like, well, what are you going to do? And Maeve is like, what are you going to do? You're going to go to the police, right? Like something bad happened. And so we have this real clear instance in which Maeve is disrupting this, right? She says, you've been assaulted, Amy, this is serious, right? Like, that's the direct quote. And then Maeve goes with Amy to the police station, and you can see her there with some of the local police. Right. And again, at that police station, Amy minimizes her assault. Amy says, it's not like I've got a proper problem. And Maeve really calmly replies, you've got a proper problem. Same deal. Amy tells a police officer what happened. She concludes by saying, we're probably wasting your time. But the officer, it's a male officer at that moment, the officer replies, you're not wasting anyone's time. Right. So we have these really clear instances in which a survivor is voicing these sort of myths, right? Like, well, what are you going to do about it? Well, nothing can be done about it. I'm, like, why even bother get upset, sort of thing. And what we see here is the bystanders stepping in and saying, hey, no, that was wrong and it shouldn't have happened to you. Right? Like, hey, no, right? Like, that was it. That was, right? That is what it is. It was a crime. And needs to go to the police. When the storyline is revisited a couple episodes later, this is Amy in the middle. So Amy hasn't been able to ride the bus ever since she was assaulted on the bus, right? Because again, this is serious. Maeve and her other friends join when they find out that Amy hasn't been able to ride the bus. They join together with Amy, even though it's not their bus stop, so that they ride the bus with her, which is just this beautiful act of solidarity with one another, and of saying, you know, here we are, bystanders. We weren't there when it happened, but once we know about it, we're going to do everything we can to support you. The other story that I'd like to show on this idea of bystanders who disrupt rape culture was from the reboot of Murphy Brown. So Murphy has been thinking about an experience that happened to her in college, in which a college professor attempted to force himself on her. So first she discusses the matter with a bartender named Phyllis. And the bartender says, "We both know what it was like back then. In those days, it wasn't sexual harassment. It was a bad date." So you can hear that echo of those kind of like shrug it off, right? But the bartender is realizing, like, we used to call it just a bad date, but now we understand, right? Like, no, there's more. And so the bartender begins this sort of moment of being a good bystander, right? Of disrupting, of saying, hey, right, like we can revisit this conversation. And Murphy says, yeah, I thought it didn't affect me, but suddenly I'm feeling that it did. So Murphy tells her son, she has an adult son. So Murphy tells her adult son what happened to her in this episode. And as she does so, she begins to blame herself. Like, oh, why did I even go to the professor's house? Right? Well, she went there because she thought it was an award ceremony. Right? Like, she had a perfectly good reason for going to a professor's house. He had told her it was an award ceremony. She expected other people to be there, but they weren't there, right? Because he was planning to assault her. Right, but she begins to take on that kind of victim blaming. She blames herself for the assault, and her adult son interjects and says, "Mom, he was your teacher. You were a teenager," because it was her first year of college. "Whatever he did to you, you didn't want it." So we see in scenes like this sex education episode and this Murphy Brown episode, what we're seeing is bystanders who speak up, who take assault seriously, and who counter victim blaming myths. Okay, so I've made it all the way through my pictures and slides, and we are headed into a solid discussion period. Let me figure out how to stop sharing.
There should be a red tab. Yep.
I got there.
So I don't currently see anything in chat, so I will assume that you're going to open up the dialogue and moderate that on your own. Just let me know if you have anything.
So what questions and ideas were percolating for you all as you thought about the TV that you've been seeing, the examples I was discussing, those different approaches? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Feel free to use the chat function. I think there's a hand raise function if you can find it, or you can just visibly raise a hand.
Do you feel like things on TV are representing equality among the genders better than they were in the 70s? I mean, you started with the 70s, but your study really didn't cover the 70s. So
no, the 70s are context. It's where TV used to be, right? Mm-hmm. I think we have seen some huge steps forward on some programs, right? Like I said, I only told you the happy stories on this one, right? From about a third of our programs that we thought really nailed it, or at least had really shout out moments. Mm-hmm. I would say there were a third that were like, oh, sort of moments. And this is one of the things that scholars have been pointing out, that we see counter discourses, especially with television, because television, it has quite niche audiences now, right? The sort of people who are going to watch the reboot of Murphy Brown are not the same people who are going to watch, fill in the blank. So you can see some really like niche sort of programming. So programs for feminists and programs for misogynists, right? And so that's one of the pieces that we can see there. So like one of the more misogynistic episodes that we watched and write about in our analysis, it focuses on the individual, right? Whether or not he actually did it. And of course, he's innocent. And of course, it was all a big witch hunt. And of course, it was all just people trying to make a good man, you know, take him down for his money, right? So it's a storyline that plays out in the ways in which we often read about these cases in the headlines, right? And that was, right, like that was a storyline that, given how extremely statistically rare it is that there are false accusations made, right? Like the data on false accusations, right, shows that it's so few, right? Then to make that story the way in which people think about the Me Too movement or conceptualize the Me Too movement, I would say is a grave error. It's certainly a misrepresentation of the real world statistics. And yet we do still see some programming like that. Yeah. So I would say there's been, in the 1970s, television was much more monolithic. There were fewer channels. This is before the big explosion of cable, right? Like cable is still just beginning to, right? This is when there's only like 5 to 10 channels, depending on where you live, right? Everyone was gonna watch one of those channels that evening, right? Like the industry was so much smaller and the audiences were so much larger. And now we fast forward and we're looking at these real niche audiences. So we can see some great examples where shows are, I think, doing really important, useful work. But we do that in a context where they're really self-selecting their audience. Yeah, lovely question. Other questions, ideas, things that you're thinking about?
Sarah,
yeah,
thank you so much for sharing the very thought-provoking information. Very, very interesting. Wondered have you ever had a student disclose in your classroom? And if so, how do you process a discussion like that?
Yeah. So usually by the time a student will disclose aloud to the whole class, they are a lot further down their processing. Like it's not the first. I have never had a student disclose aloud during class discussion and it'd be the first time that person has ever disclosed, right? They've processed it for a while before they're going to share in that sort of context. So So it's a little bit different. I have students disclose often for the first time in their papers for my classes, which is a really difficult sort of thing to do. So for very good reasons, all college professors are mandatory reporters. This means that if we hear something that we think was a crime, we are required to report it to public safety, to the Title IX office, to student development, et cetera. And that is true whether it's a case of sexual assault or whether it's a case of theft, right? We are mandatory reporters. If we hear something that we think is a crime, we are required to report it. And so I tell my students, because I teach a lot of women and gender studies classes, and I tell my students, right, if you come to me during office hours and want to talk to me about something that might have been a crime, like I'm gonna have to report that. But the things that are said aloud during class discussion and the things that are written in course assignments are covered under academic integrity acts. And I do not have to disclose those. Right, so it's a really, and it's a really weird fine line, right? Like if you talk about it during class, that's not going to be reported. If you stay after class and follow up with me outside of our 50-minute time period, now I have to report it. Right. So I try to be really upfront and clear with students, because the last thing I want to do is be reporting things, sending students stories in places where the students weren't ready for it to go. So I try to be really clear about how disclosure works. And at the same time, also tell them like, these are people on our campus who are not mandatory reporters. So our chaplains, and we have a sexual assault prevention coordinator named Christian. So we have a couple places where you can go and you can tell your story, whatever it may be, and it will stay there, no matter what. Yeah, but so by the time a student is ready to disclose in a classroom, it's not their first time. And usually I try to follow the student's lead on it, right? So if the student says something along the lines of, well, I've been assaulted and I know X, Y, or Z, right? Like, I would never press for details. I would never, right? Like I would never ask a follow-up sort of thing. But I do sometimes ask the student to kind of think about what sort of norms or cultural norms of behavior they would want to see in the world, right? Like, what are the ways in which we would want to be behaving, right? It's easy for us to say like sexual violence should never happen, but how do we chart the next step, right? So is there something that you would like to have more bystanders doing? Or is there something that you wish was different about our legal system? So that kind of follow-up question I sometimes make.
Okay. Thank
you.
Yeah. Sarah, it seems like the pace of high-profile cases has certainly diminished. I mean, you know, there for a while, it was every other week, it was a newscaster, a corporate executive, a Hollywood type that was being accused. And now it seems like I don't really hear much anymore.
Yeah.
So why do you think that is?
Couple answers. I think my first is probably the most relevant, and that's that it's just not, the media cycles have short attention spans, right? Like this was headline worthy once or twice, and then not. You know, or like we had 2 years of these headlines and then, okay, so right, we got to put something else up. So media cycles have short attention spans. It would be one piece that I would suggest is at play. I think also we have been having these news stories. I think about Cuomo. I think about one of the candidates for the New York City mayor was also accused. So we have been having some really high profile accusations. What we haven't been having are investigations that lead to somebody being fired, right? Which I find really interesting. And we might say, well, the person was not a perpetrator and shouldn't have lost their job, right? Yeah, maybe. Again, the rate of false disclosure is so low. It's about 2%, right? 2% of the cases turn out to be false accusations. So, yeah, I guess I kind of think that I see the structure at play, protecting men and other types of perpetrators who are financially lucrative for an industry, who are, yeah, in powerful positions. Yeah.
Well, it just gives you a lot to think about. And it doesn't seem to me that very many people from the, what I'll call flurry of accusations, really went to jail.
No.
You know, 1 or 2, but I mean, Bill O'Reilly's out there making a bucket of money again. And so, and you know, like Cuomo and some others are just openly defiant. So that really does stack the odds yet again.
Yeah.
I think, you know.
Yeah. Which is one of the reasons why Tarana Burke's original Me Too work was so very much focused on healing survivors and healing and changing culture, right? Like, we are unlikely to see justice served in so many cases. The question is, can we prevent the next generation from doing this again? Right.
Sarah,
yeah,
I would just like to say that I think tied to your last statement there, I just think the bystander disruption piece of this presentation is such a critical piece. And when I think of being a bystander 50 years ago compared to today, and how I might respond to an individual who's had an experience like that is really quite different. Yeah. And so I hope that that means some progress from a cultural standpoint, in addition to a personal standpoint. And so I guess I don't know if there's a question there, except that I think that bystander piece is so critical, and the support we can provide each other. The other thing that occurred to me was the whole Schembechler's son accusation. It's hard to speak about someone who is not here to defend themselves, but that he didn't, you know, according to his son, did not want to hear, because if he heard the information, he must act on it. And I think there's still an awful lot of that about what people in positions that need to act on it, you know, would rather not hear the information.
Yeah, so two different responses there quickly. The first is that Law and Order SVU, which is an NBC program, ran a Matt Lauer story before the Matt Lauer headlines broke. Matt Lauer was an NBC anchor, right? So we're like, and it's to the detail. It's the button under the desk and the door that closed, like it's to the detail, which means that it was an open secret at NBC what Matt Lauer was doing, right? That their fictional scripted programs made an entire episode exactly to the T here before the headlines broke, right? So again, right, like people who know but don't want to know. And that's what the show Younger said explicitly, right? Like, honey, we all knew, we just didn't want to believe our golden goose was a horny toad, right? Like we knew, we just didn't want to hear it. Yeah, and then to the bystander piece, like what can we say instead? So in graduate school, I was stalked by one of my peers. And after several months of not knowing what to do and trying to get him not to stalk me and not even realizing it was stalking, right? Because that's such a big word. You know, after months of handling it by myself, I began to tell people because I was really scared. And so I was seeking help. And I told so many people, because he had joined my church. So I told my pastor. He had joined my Bible study. So I told my Bible study leader. He joined my classes. So I told my like teaching supervisor. He right, like, and, you know, I got back a solid slate of answers that were like, well, did you lead him on? Like, does he think that you're just gonna, does he have reason to believe that you actually do want to date him? Right? Like, have you tried being less friendly? You know, well, what did you say the first time you met him? He's kind of an awkward guy. Did you smile too much? So like, I got like this solid slate of things, you know, like, are you sure it's stalking? Maybe he's just a really devout Christian like you are. Right? It's like, sort of things, but he leaves me creepy gifts, right? Like, oh, well, that could just be sweet. I was like, but they're not sweet, they're creepy, right? So, right, like, so I began to tell bystanders, people who were in positions of authority who could have stepped in, right, to try to help. And I got nowhere. I told the police, I went to the police because I was running out of options. I went to the police and they asked me, has he physically hurt you yet? I said, no. And they say, we'll come back when he does, which sounded like a bad idea. Yeah, so I ended up at a women's center because again, these are women's problems. I ended up at a women's center, and by this time I was carrying around still have a literal stack. It's a folder with all of the letters and all of the things and all, right? Like I was carrying around stacks of evidence. So, you know, I like begin to pull out all of my evidence for this woman at the women's center. And I'm like, and, you know, she stops me, right? Like, and she goes, I believe you. He's stalking you. Right? And it was the first time I had told a bystander. And encountered anything other than a rape myth. Right. The police, I don't think they meant it this way, but essentially they told me you don't have a real problem yet. Right. Wait till he actually hurts you. Yeah. So yeah. Right. Like as bystanders, we're in totally different places now than we were 10 years ago or 30 years ago. And I remember that. Like I remember that as a really powerful moment for me, right? That somebody believed me, that I had a serious problem, that someone might help me. Right? Like, because if you're going to help somebody, you have to first believe them. It's a prereq. Other questions, thoughts and ideas?
I'm sure you're aware of the work of Jackson Katz.
Yes.
Which I think really takes it from a woman's problem to a man's problem, you know, and I really admire that he's willing to. I'm sure he gets a lot of blowback.
I'm sure.
His work. But if for anybody who doesn't know about him, do you want to tell a little bit about what he does?
Yeah, so he's a feminist activist. So he's a male speaker, writer, author, documentary filmmaker. He has a large oeuvre. And one of the kind of stump speeches that he often starts with, it goes something like this, and I might mangle it. But he said, he follows the grammar, right? So he essentially says like, Joey hit Susie. But then if you put that into passive voice, we can say Susie was hit, right? But this has just eliminated the perpetrator from the whole scenario, right? We took Joey out of the sentence. So Susie was hit. And then if we, finagle it around, we can get to Susie was beaten, use a synonym there, and suddenly we've got Susie is a battered woman, right? Where we started with a sentence where Joey hit Susan, which clearly attributed blame, right, to Joey. But we ended with a sentence, the really common phrase, battered woman, that has reduced her entire identity and made the battery be about her. Right. So the complexity and humanity of the victim has been boiled down to the point where she is the problem. The problem is that there's a battered woman, right? Which makes her the problem. And Joey is left entirely out of sight. And so Jackson Katz, he does it much smoother than that. But that's one of his opening stump speeches to show how we get to thinking about sexual violence and gendered violence as a woman's problem. Oh, those battered women, if only we could do something about them, right? We think about it as a women's problem. But he says, if we go back to an actual active voice sentence, Joey hit Susie, right? Like we can see that the problem lies over here. It lies specifically with the ways in which we've come to understand masculinity as being all about strength, all about power, all about control. Yeah.
And in some ways, lack of control, right? If a girl dresses a certain way, somehow they're activated. Oh my God, I can't control myself.
Yes, right. It's this little paradox, right? Where you become a man by being in control of your scenario, being able to tell the woman that dinner has to be on at 5 or, whatever. And yet you're also this uncontrollable beast as soon as you have that first sip of alcohol or see that shoulder with
visually activated.
Yes, just the
yeah. Oh, spaghetti strap.
Oh yeah, spaghetti strap, right? Like, so my students still have really intense, well, my female students really have intense dress codes, right? And it's one of the places where they are able to point out, like, there really was nothing sexual about my shoulder until you told people that there was something sexual about my shoulder.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So Sarah, I wanted to thank you for sharing your experience. But I have to say, if you're talking about 10 years ago, where are we now? What are your students saying now? It's just, I don't have any Kleenex here to cry or to rage, but and then I look at my own 3 daughters. I have a son and 3 daughters. And what did I pass on? Don't dress like that. Don't do that. Don't, so it's like holding a mirror up, but I want hope. I want hope that your students are having a different experience. So you can go ahead and make it up for me too. I don't know.
I know. I think I did one of these HASC presentations about a year ago, specifically about like Joe Biden and picking vice presidents and something or other like that. And I was not very optimistic at the end of that one. Really, even though he'd committed to picking a female vice president, I was quite a downer last time. I think it's really hard statistically to answer the question of whether or not things are getting better, because we are seeing an upswing in disclosures, right? What we think is an upswing in disclosures. We think more victims, more survivors are willing to disclose to the police that they had a crime committed against them. So we see an uptick, right? And I would say that in and of itself is progress. It looks like the numbers are getting worse and worse, but we think the numbers aren't worse. It's just that more people are willing to disclose. We do know that this last year was a particularly violent year for domestic violence during the pandemic, as perpetrators and their survivors were enclosed together in small spaces. So the domestic violence, intimate partner battery skyrocketed this year during the pandemic. So that's not very optimistic, sorry. But I think what I see in my students, first of all, I see full women's studies classrooms, right? I teach to packed houses, which has not always been the case. So that to me seems optimistic that more people are seeking out this sort of information, more people are seeking out knowledge in these areas. And I think we see I think I see students who are more likely to say, I believe you, when presented with a credible story. And I think I see more students who are likely to speak up during a party if they see something going badly. Right. There was a party on Hope's campus not that long ago where 4 women experienced intoxication levels that were not in keeping with how much they'd been drinking, right? Which is the legal lease for describing that they'd been roofied. And they were okay because their friends noticed that they were too drunk, right? For how drunk they should have been. Or not drunk at all, as they should have been. Like they hadn't drunken much, right? Like that was obvious. So their bystanders intervened, right? Their friends noticed and their friends kept them safe, which is a level of responsibility that no 19-year-old or 21-year-old should have to bear. And yet is at least a first step, right?
So the response when they report, I guess that's the question I'm asking too. Are they getting more? I get it from the peers, but if they brought it to someone on Hope's campus, obviously if they brought it to you and you're going to report, I understand you would be supported and validated, but are you hearing that it's still victim blaming and shaming?
I hope not. And the short answer is that I honestly don't know.
Okay.
I know our victim advocate quite well, Christian. Right, so we have an advocate on campus, somebody who walks alongside survivors and helps them go through the steps to make a report. There are two, but these are two different processes. So there's a report that would be a criminal process with the police. Any report that happens within HOPE's structure is simply a HOPE process, where the most extreme punishment that can ever be taken is to expel a student, right? Like, that's the only thing, that's the most extreme thing HOPE can do to any student. And so we have these two really, right? Like, so these are two really different processes. And sometimes students just say, I don't want to go to the police. I just want to never have to be in a classroom with this person. So, and again, we're trying to leave things to be really student driven, right? Like, we don't want to begin processes that the survivor isn't ready to have begun.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like we can just wide differences between what's going to happen and how a student is going to progress through those processes. The Trump administration formally changed things to make things harder on survivors to step through the process, requiring some elements like a face-to-face meeting, an attempt to talk it out between the survivor and the they're called respondents in our process, and we didn't used to have that as a requirement, and honestly that's a huge roadblock when survivors find out that they would have to sit in the same room with the person that they say has done these things to them. They will often pull out of the process rather than go through it. But that's a federal mandate and there's not much we can do about it. Yeah. Bill, you've had a hand.
I'm just wondering, Professor Cornfield, if you ever have any male students in your gender studies classes. Just would be interested to know. I have no idea.
No. Yeah. So not very many, Bill. I have had one male identified student since I began teaching. Well, there's a dicey question. In a class that calls itself Women and Gender Studies, I've had one male identified student. The rest have been women or non-binary students. But I teach a comm class called Gender and Communication, and it's at a real sweet spot in the time, in the class scheduling times. It's at 1 o'clock, so the students have woken up, they've had lunch, then they're ready to take their classes. So I get a lot of men in that class who have quite a surprise experience. Yes, so they didn't sign up. They knew it had gender in the title. It's not a complete shock. But they took the class because it was a good time slot, and then they learn a lot, which is what they should do in college. So so the short answer there is very few men are self-selecting into these sort of classes.
So the advocate to walk with somebody who's making an accusation, you said that the name was Christian. So is that a male? And then
no, it's a woman.
Okay, because that just struck me odd that I wouldn't think someone would want to confide. But when I take the long view back, when I was in school, there were no gender studies, so it wasn't like even I could sign up. So nobody could sign up.
No.
So we're making progress, but yet, this is decades ago when I was back there. So that just makes me sad. Is it going to take another 50 years? Sometimes I just get too discouraged, I think.
Yeah.
And are there any gender women's studies classes in high schools these days, or is that just a college thing? Or do you know?
I don't know about the high school curricula. My guess is that it's probably something that might be taught in elite private schools, but is not going to be part of our public school curriculum. Yeah. anytime soon. Yeah. Yeah, I think about this long view. I know my students find it quite energizing to think about teaching the next generation. To think about what can be done with younger people, with their younger siblings, their nieces and nephews. I know that my students find a lot of optimism as they look towards ways in which we can shift culture, and culture has shifted quite rapidly, not uniformly, not across the whole board, right? Like, but there have been major turning points, right? Like, I used to say in classes things like men and women should be paid equal pay for equal work, right? Nice 1960s slogan, right? Equal pay for equal work. And I would have students that would say, well, it's not possible to pay everyone the same amount, and we need some way to differentiate, and gender's a good way because ultimately they're going to be moms. Right, like, so, right, like within my last decade of teaching, that was a pretty regular thing. And now if I say equal pay for equal work, pretty much everyone, even the boys that I affectionately think of as frat boys, know to toe the party line, right? They know to say, yes, equal pay for equal work. Yes, everyone should have equality. And it's much later down that somebody might ask, well, how do we know that they're doing the same amount of work, right? Or how do we know that they're not receiving equal pay already? So I would say that, like, I've seen some pretty significant shifts in just my students' responses. And I've seen some pretty significant shifts, not that bullying and harassment doesn't happen, but sometimes I'm really surprised, right? Like sometimes I see a student who is wearing an outfit that I think is likely to get them bullied. Like the classic example of like boys wearing pink, right? Like sometimes I see a student wearing an outfit that I think is likely to get them bullied. And I would say it's on these like surface level things like that, but being bullied is a really significant problem. I don't want to minimize it, but it is this kind of like surface, like, oh, I can see difference. Oh, I can see gender. Oh, I can, right? Like, oh, it's at like that level that I see a lot of shifts where instead of bullying the boy who's wearing pink, the like manly men in my classes will instead say things like, oh, it looks really good on you. And they don't say it sarcastically. Right, so like I see these sort of shifts, and that is like just the top layer, and yet I think it makes a really big difference, right? If you go from being bullied to affirmed, like that's a pretty big shift in your day-to-day life. So I know some small pieces of optimism there.
I found your comment about TV reflecting the culture very thought-provoking.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because you often read things like when something bad happens and then the town mayor comes out and says, oh, that's not who we are. I always think, well, yeah, it is who you are. That's what just happened in your city. So, you know, I see a lot of stuff on TV that just, you know, kind of makes me do this. So that's kind of interesting. I think I'll think about that over the next week or so in terms of what I watch and what's offered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it is a funhouse mirror, right? Reflecting back, but also shaping and influencing. And it's not, again, we get into these kind of niches, right? These little niche sort of slices. And one of the most interesting things about television is that it is not a democratic medium. We think of it that way, like, well, did it have good ratings? Did a lot of people watch it? Okay, then it must be popular. Okay, therefore that must be what people really do want to watch, right? Like, all right, there it is. But kind of two pieces to step back from there. The first is, it might feel like we have endless choice, but we don't actually have endless choice, right? Like people are going to watch something, right? Like just because I am watching a rerun episode of The Office doesn't mean that that's what I wanted to watch. It means that that was what was on and was what my husband had on, right? Right? Like there's a little piece there, right? So it's not democratic, actually, in the same way that representative republics are not democratic, right? Like I can't, well, sure, I could write in somebody's name, but I can't literally vote for anyone and expect it to succeed, right? Like I was given two options in a party system, well, four, but only two of them technically matter, right? Right? So in this kind of like representative way, first of all, like what's on TV is not necessarily what somebody would have wanted to watch, as much as what they wanted to watch out of the options available that night. And then second, when we look at those ratings and the decisions about what to keep on TV and what gets canceled for not having good enough ratings, those ratings are not a cross section of America. Those ratings are taken from 0.2% of American households. Nielsen only surveys 0.2% of Americans. So that's all of the decisions being made about what stays on TV is reflective of 0.2% of Americans. And some Americans are considered more valuable audiences than other Americans. And that's how we decide what stays on TV. So when we talk about a series having good ratings, we don't mean that a lot of people watch it. What we mean is that it's 18 to about 40-year-old upper income white males watch it. That's the right, for the widest range audience. If they're not actually looking for the widest range, they're looking for that audience because that's who they assume has disposable income, who are still young enough to change brand allegiances, right? Still young enough to swap from buying Fords to buying Subarus because now they want a safe family car. Anyway. So it's a really interesting thing. Other shows, many of the shows that I was surveying are not looking for 18 to 40-year-old white rich males. They're looking for 18 to 40-year-old rich women. So that same idea of somebody young enough to swap brand allegiance, but still at the height of their purchasing power, right? And so when the Funhouse mirror reflects back at us, they are absolutely reflecting back this skewed vision, a vision that skews to what they think rich people want, what they think young people want. So yeah, it's an intriguing TV world. I like it a lot. Other questions? We're just about running out of time. I've really loved having this discussion with you all. I knew I wanted to save plenty of time for conversation. But yeah, things you're seeing on TV, things that you find intriguing.
Well, it sounds like we have answered a lot of the questions. I'm sure that people will take some time to think about all this material. Very thought-provoking, and we thank you. Amy, I'm sure she would agree that we appreciate your time and you putting all this information together. I can see why you have full houses in a lot of your classes.
Thank you.
You're an excellent presenter. So thank you. If we can all just give her a virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
I think I speak for all of us when I say, keep up the good work.
Mm-hmm.
Keep fighting the good fight. You're doing well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And let's recruit some people of different genders into your classes.
Yes.
Different. I'm trying to be, but I was listening on and off, and that is a statistic or a fact that I hope does change, is that just listening and having many people listen to this topic and try to gain an understanding will help move this forward. So thank you for everyone here who's doing that, and have a wonderful afternoon. And Sarah, if you have any questions, you can call the office directly or you can stay on with me. Otherwise, I'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good to see you.